Hello everybody. If you're anything like me, you like to play Warhammer or other war games, you'll end up with a lot of this sort of thing. And that is empty sprue, maybe some little bits left here and there. You might not know what to do with it. I'll show you what to do with it in this video. So, today we're going to be using a couple different pairs of sprue cutters, a hobby knife, model glue, and a file. And if you care about the table you're cutting on, you might want a cutting mat like I have. So the first step is to start cutting out any pieces left in the sprue. You'll probably want to save these, as they may be handy in the future for making terrain, of course, or converting models. For example, you could have an arm sticking out of a pile of rubble, or use the excess weapons to make a sort of weapons cache. The flags I'm cutting out of these sprues are actually going to be used later in the video to make objective markers. Stay tuned for that. Once you're finished, you'll likely have a ton of pieces to store. I'll show you my methods for that coming up next. And you'll also have the empty sprue ready to move on to the next step. And if you're like me, you've collected a ton of this stuff. One method of storage is to just put them in any empty container you got, like this empty screws container, for example. However, my preferred method is to use an organizer like this, and sort the pieces according to what they are so I can find them easier when I'm looking for something. Here's sponsons. Over here we've got other accessories or something. Can't remember exactly. Then, for example, this bin is heavy weapons. Moving on, the next step is to cut off the parts of the sprue that formerly attach to the pieces of the model to the sprue. Feel free to skip this step, however I find that it's easier to work with later on when this is done. As you can see, just cutting off any of those pieces, and then you also want to cut it flush on the back. Again, not required, but I highly recommend it. Getting the sprue broken down into bits is the longest part of the process. I suggest having a nice long music playlist, audiobook, TV or YouTube series playing in the background. Trust me, I tried to do this in silence and it nearly drove me insane. Just have something to keep your sanity. As you can see, the sprue has become very bare now. This also leaves you with bits you could use as a fine rubble, rocks, or gravel, or whatever. There are two methods of continuing from this point that I'll show you. The first is going to be cutting these round bits off flush with the sprue. And this is pretty easy, they just pop, pop, pop right off. Very easy to cut flush. This is probably the fastest and easiest method. At this point, you'll have these little round bits, and then the aforementioned rubble. This next step involves, unsurprisingly, more cutting. You're going to cut the sprue up into whatever pieces you like. Long pieces, short pieces, twisted pieces. I usually stick to 4 main categories, which are short, medium, long, and twisted. And here we have a long piece for you, for example. It's a long. Next up, I'll cut out a little short, twisted piece. This is pretty small in comparison to all the other pieces that I cut up that are twisted. Usually like to keep them big so I can cut them down later. And this one will be a short piece. And you can cut the ends flush if you prefer. I usually don't. And here's a better example of these twisted pieces that I'm talking about for you. A bit bigger, that way you can chop them up further if you like. Even processing one sprue this way is going to leave you with quite a bit of material to use. Another thing to note about this process is to be mindful that things don't try to launch across the room when you cut it. Ask me how I know. Here we have the long pieces, the short pieces, and then the twisted pieces, all from one sprue, and I'll show you next how I organize all this stuff. This is a fishing tackle organizer of some kind. My favorite part about this box is that you can take these dividers out and kind of adjust how long the compartments are. Organizing these bits is not required, but I find it quite helpful. Moving on to method 2. Remember those round bits? Instead of cutting them off of the sprue, we're just going to cut them out on either side. As you can see here, on the right and then on the left, and it's gone. And of course you can do either way you prefer. I prefer this method. It does tend to take a little bit longer using this method, and it's a bit more tedious, but I typically find that the bits are a bit easier to work with in the end, less cleanup involved. As you can see here, we are left with pieces that you can break down further into whatever shapes you like, or leave as is, and then more of that rubble material. So grab your leftover sprue your friends gave you, sprue that you found in the dumpster, go buy some more models so you have some more sprue, pull some sprue out of the void. I have more sprue, and even more sprue. Practically drowning in sprue. Which is why I'm doing this video. I finally have something to do with it. So grab your cutters and start cutting away. Go crazy now. After cutting up not even a quarter of all the sprue that I have, I've pretty much filled my organizer. And you can see I also ended up with these sort of frame looking pieces, which I'll show you what I do with those later on in the video. And there's those medium pieces that I was talking about before. Didn't really have anything to show you, but there they are. Long pieces, twisted pieces, rubble over here. Got the short pieces galore, and then more rubble down on the bottom. First up, we'll be making those flag objective markers that I was talking about earlier. And for this, you're going to need 40mm base. Not actually required, but it makes it look cleaner. Need a flag. This one's got the hand still attached, which I'll cut and file this off. And then a bunch of short pieces for the pile of rubble. So there you have it. Pretty quick and simple little objective marker, which doesn't require too many pieces, just a little bit of work. I built 2, and I'll build a 3rd, that way there's 3 objectives for games. Next up is a pile of rubble. And for this, we'll be using predominantly short pieces again, but there's also long pieces and twisted pieces in there. And then some of that rubble for extra detail. Got a pile of short pieces here, and this is a twisted piece I'll use as a base. This is a twisted piece that'll be sticking out of the pile of rubble. Here we are. I'll start by gluing the twisted piece to the base piece here, sticking out in somewhat a direction that I think will look good. And we'll start gluing on short pieces one by one, and use plenty of glue here. Otherwise it might not hold together. If you're using a model cement like I am, you want to make sure you give it plenty of time before you start moving around. You can see I'm kind of putting the first little pieces here flush with the base piece, and later on I'll kind of start stacking them at odd angles. But for now we're just trying to establish a firm base on which everything can sit. Next up is to be adding some finer pieces of rubble throughout to add texture and interest. The difference might be hard to tell here on camera, but I assure you the difference is striking in person. Maybe not as much as you'd think, but it's a clear difference. And here's the complete piece. I've added a piece of I-beam styrene sticking out there, kind of adds some more interest. Thought this was kind of a bland piece, but now it looks pretty good. Now last up is using some of those frames and adding a bit of sheet styrene. You can make some pretty convincing destroyed buildings. Even added bullet holes here to kind of give it that battlefield look. Now there's a whole lot more you can do with sprue. You can go crazy with the detail, really, as far as your imagination can take you. I hope this video was at least an inspiration to you. Go out there and build your own terrain. Thanks for watching.